Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcasts. Today, we will be discussing innovation and the power of telling the innovation story. I'm delighted to welcome Susan Lindner, CEO and founder of Innovation Storytellers. Susan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. One Susie to another.
Yeah, Susie squared. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. Susan, you've done lots of different things, and your path to date has been really quite eclectic. So from anthropology and religion to international aid work and epidemiology, and then communications and now innovation. And I did ask myself, wow, what's the link there? But we will come to that. You've also lived in lots of different countries. So lots of cultural layers there, and you've also eaten Nutella in at least 29 of those countries. I love that little fact that I found on your website. But anyway, let's get back to your passion for communication and innovation. So if I look, you're a qualified anthropologist, you've studied religion, you've done lots of other things. So how did you get into the topic of innovation, and where did that start for you?
Well, I think like all folks who work in innovation, we share one common trait, which is an insatiable curiosity to go, I wonder why that is.
Yeah.
Why does it work like that? And what if we changed it? And what if we made it a little bit better? And what if? Like we were those annoying 2-year-olds who kept asking why the sky was blue, why the clouds changed. Like that was us. And, I didn't have a name for it when I was younger, but it was not just my desire to observe those new phenomenon, but I was the one who was always talking too much in class. I was the storyteller from jump. So I think it is probably the most recurring comment on one of my report cards from school, from primary all the way up to high school, is talks too much in class. And so I can still remember a road trip that my university friends and I took from Pennsylvania down to the very edge of Florida, down to the Keys, the islands surrounding Florida. And we drove, it was called the Voyage of the Damned. We drove for 24 hours straight, and my job was to keep the drivers awake. At one point, one of the drivers said, I will pay you to stop talking. And I lasted 5 minutes. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about the insatiable curiosity and the endless desire to tell people about it is where this kind of bread and butter comes together for me.
And it's really interesting, isn't it? Because behind that, I'm hearing also a need and a want for connection. So really connecting to people through your stories. And if I look at international aid work, because I'm still really fascinated, Susan, about how you got from international aid work to what you do today, although the more you talk about it, the more I see the link. But it's interesting, this subject of connection. So if I look at my lens of international aid working is about connecting with people, the empathy of understanding where they're at, even if it's something you've never experienced. So it'd be really interesting if we started there and you could sort of tell us how you went from that to innovation.
Sure. So I wrote my thesis on AIDS, prostitution, and tourism in Thailand. That was the genesis of my work and curiosity around those areas. And I wrote about an organization that was helping women to get out of sex work by turning them into entrepreneurs and helping them start their own businesses.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I want to go work for that organization. Wrote letters for 2 years to no avail, and then wound up getting a response. And within 8 weeks, I was working for the largest nonprofit in Thailand, whom your listeners will clearly know as the Samakom Patana Pachakon Net Chumchon, which is
that one. Yeah, okay.
Right. That's where our Oxfam money goes now, right? It's
Brilliant.
the Population and Community Development Association. And so I worked in rural Thailand, helping women who didn't want to be sex workers anymore to start their own businesses. And the reason why that was so imperative is that because 1 in 6 sexually active people were HIV positive when I got to Thailand, and specifically to my area. And the red light district where I'd assigned to work had already shut down because most of the customers and the sex workers there had died of HIV. And so, but like good capitalists, where there is demand, there is market. And so another red light district had opened up just down the block.
Okay.
So that's where my work began. And I realized that from an innovation standpoint, the only protection we had to help people to fight HIV was the condom. So, Susie, if I asked you, how old do you think the condom is? How long has the condom been with us in our human history?
Wow.
What would be your guess?
From, I don't know, maybe 60, 70 years?
So the first evidence of the condom was actually found in a cave painting in France, in the Carombel, 10,000 years ago. This archaeological evidence has now been corroborated in Egypt as well. We're finding remains of, if you can imagine, condoms from back in the day. So I don't know if that cave painting was a public health message or somebody gloating about last night.
But visual storytelling.
Yeah, that's the first visual storytelling. Public health visual storytelling was great. And so that is how old the condom is, right? So when we talk about innovation, not a breakthrough. So in asking myself, how do we get people to change their behavior, which innovation asks everyone to say, stop doing what you've been doing and now do the thing, right? Innovation is inherently about behavior change.
Yeah.
But I had a very old product. And so the only thing that I could think to change was the story that surrounded it. Because the story that was circulating at the time was get AIDS and die.
Okay.
And we needed to change that story to what if the condom was the gateway to future that you want, Mr. and Mrs. Sex Worker. So that conversation shifted and said, and my clients were seeing 8 clients a night. So if you used a condom each and every single time, you might have a chance at the future that you desire. And by the way, I'm going to train you in creating that future so you can see it and make it real. And that program helped drop new HIV infection rates by about 26%. It was the story, it wasn't the tool. And that set off a little light bulb in my head. Fast forward, I got back to the United States, worked in HIV for another 4 or 5 years, and then shifted to this new thing that was happening called the internet. And I had a Hotmail account. So clearly I was well-versed in everything I needed to know about internet and decided to shift gears and work in PR for tech startups in Silicon Valley and in New York and London. And so I worked at an agency doing that and realized once again, the story was the bridge between new technologies, new ideas, and getting people to change their behavior about how to interact with those technologies. And I became a bit of a tech translator to journalists who wanted to understand all of this revolution that was going on in Silicon Valley, but needed plain language, not computer scientist language to talk about. And that's how I got my clients into the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and all of these places, was by being able to tell a relatable story that mattered to the readers. Today, I do that with chief innovation officers and their team members and helping turn them into amazing storytellers themselves, get the funding and the timelines and the resources and frankly, the recognition they deserve for their breakthrough ideas. So it's the story, not the tech, that is really the bridge between whether or not an idea gets funded and gets to market. It's not the technology itself. It needs a story. Otherwise, that breakthrough could very easily die if the story doesn't.
Yeah, so the story is like the bridge between human and tech, if you like. But I always remember being blown away when I visited Australia and we went to the Aboriginal Centre and we found out a lot about their culture, and they were telling us that they only used to communicate in song lines and stories. And that was the way they communicated. They didn't have language outside of that. And I remember thinking, wow, stories are what make the world go round and all these other things we hear. But you're almost back to your roots, aren't you, in terms of anthropology and religion and the role that stories played there. So if we could just look at the role that stories played, particularly in religion and creating followers, let's put it that way, and in convincing people, we can see that humans don't change that much. So innovation is about the behavior and the stories. But what did you learn from that, Susan, that you've sort of translated into the sort of today's world around innovation and behavioral change?
Yeah, so I have dual degrees in religion and anthropology, you're right, comparative religion. And
Mm.
what fascinated me about religion was how the prophets were able to move the word around the world.
Mm.
And they did it without Twitter. Shocking. And
How did they do that?
so there are kind of 5 steps that these prophets used in order to really have us not just telling stories, but continue to tell stories thousands of years after their death.
Yeah.
I often refer to the prophets as the greatest viral marketers of all time. And that is because, number one, they were selling us an idea that was invisible and unprovable, right? And number two, for our mere human minds, right? And the other was that they were able to get us to keep sharing their story long after their death.
Yeah.
So I wanted to break down how the prophets did it. And here's what I discovered. There are 5 steps of how the prophets did it. Number one was they relied on a shared history, right? Jesus never claimed to not be a Jew, right? He didn't start a religion. He was going about his life in a way that he thought was corrective of what was happening at the time. As most innovators are, they say, you know, this is pretty good, but we either need to get back to our roots or we need to see things in a new light,
Yes.
right? You go to orthodoxy or you go through progressivism, right? These are the two.
Yes, the either or thing.
Right. And that's how most prophets appear. So when you look at them, they go, first, we rely on a shared history. So where do we all come from is step one. We're telling a great story. Where's the common ground for both of us? And so that's why we share so many similar holidays and calendars and so forth, right? Is those rituals are very ingrained in who we are. Step two is there must be a basis in values, in core values of our story. When we want people to engage in behavior change, what are the values that we all agree on as part of that history? And number two, what are the new values that we're going to incorporate? So if we want people to adopt a new behavior change, we have to give them a new value that they agree on is worthwhile, because the old ones aren't sufficient anymore. It's not that they're bad, they're just not sufficient. Step three is the message, right? And this is where we activate that new value. So it's how do I go from an eye for an eye to turn the other cheek? Right? That's the message. It's also quite catchy. Thank you. So if we can wrap that message, it's short and sweet and sound bites that make it memorable, because an innovative message also requires momentum in order for other people to adopt it. So stories create memory, create momentum in an innovation story. So that's a good one. Eye for an eye to turn the other cheek. The next is, how do we then get other people to start telling it? So how do we identify a group of early adopters? 12 apostles are 40 friends that the Buddha took with him into the forest, right? Who were his Sangha, that who would follow him. And they begin to disseminate the word, right? So they absorb the teachings, they hear it, because what we found, frankly, as a result of user-generated content studies and social media studies, is that it is no longer sufficient in our current economy to just have the prophet tell the story.
Yeah.
In fact, you don't even believe it if it's just the talking head saying it and no. Now it's, so we actually need, in order to tell a viral story, we need other people to tell it for us. That means you have to pre-program it with all the good stuff so that people can share it. So for our corporate listeners, right, our big organization listeners, when you want to tell a story, are you creating the mechanisms by which people can share it easily? And then the last piece is thinking about the language itself. So asking your listeners to think about, you know, your year 7 grammar class, when you learned about simile, metaphor, rhyme, alliteration, all the techniques that Madison Avenue and politicians use every day in order to get, you know, something stuck in your head. Those techniques are really necessary inside of big companies, and especially within innovation, to have rallying cries for people, even when it's hard, even when my prototype is failing, when I can't get buy-in from the board. that we have a rallying cry that says, we're going to keep sharing it. We're going to keep talking about it. We're going to dig in. You know, love is all you need is a good one, or today's version, love is love, right? So these things help us stay grounded and connected to the mission of change.
And I think one of the challenges is to tell the story in a way that's as impactful as the first time it was told, so that you can create followers. And if I look at the religious sort of parallels there, you know, the 12 disciples, there were people who doubted. And I think there are early adopters who doubt, and that's human, isn't it, to go through these waves of
we must
either fear or, yes, of course, to create a different perspective on it. But just coming to different perspectives, and to finish off with the fascinating world that you were in before, the whole cultural thing. If we're talking about communication, Susan, impactful communication doesn't look, feel, or sound the same, does it, in different national cultures?
No.
So when I was thinking about what you do and the global scope within which you do it, I was thinking, I wonder, in terms of impact and reaching populations, how you manage the cultural layers. If I come to some of our listeners from large multinational corporations, where innovation is already difficult enough due to the antibodies in the culture, because that's not the way we do stuff around here.
Right.
What are you seeing around the cultural layer? And I'm talking about national culture, because work culture is normally a little bit more homogenous than the national cultures that it houses, if you like. Or that's my view on it.
It definitely is. And it certainly takes on the culture of where HQ is based, right?
Yes.
If you're a French company operating in Francophone Africa, it's going to be quite different than if you're an American company operating in Beijing.
Of course.
Or vice versa, right? A Japanese company operating in New Jersey. So step one is getting really clear about the cultural values of the tribe that you're currently in. So in your corporate culture, and being able to name them.
Okay.
Step two is then, you know, I love design thinking, and in all my storytelling, I use empathy mapping.
Yeah.
So empathy mapping starts with asking the question before you ever start telling the story, what matters to my listener? And there are two big questions in here that anyone who's thinking about telling an international story to ask the question is, number one, if my listener says yes, right? Number one, what would it take to get them to say yes to my breakthrough idea? What would they need to hear? What matters most to them? And then also the flip side of that is, what is the pain of saying yes to the breakthrough idea?
Yeah.
So is there a loss of face if I've built my career on the previous technology that was here? I've built whole teams. I've gotten raises and promotions around the cool old idea. And now I have to go back to start with the new intern that just got hired to learn the system. So how do I protect for that loss of face, maybe, or loss of reputation or risk? German cultures are terrified by risk, adopting, you know, and so how do I tell a story that mitigates risk as the primary driver, let's say? And the other side is, what's the gain? Am I really clear about what the gain is for my listener when they get all the benefits, the supposed benefits of my innovation? And do I know what matters to them? Because what matters to someone in Peru is going to be very different than people in Pretoria or in the Philippines. Ask the questions first. What is the pain of saying yes? What is the gain that I'll get? Because the gains are actually going to be quite different. And when you can tell a story that's based on my listeners' challenges and benefits, then you can tell a culturally appropriate story. The other is, I just wrote a blog post about this today. It's coming out today on LinkedIn. Is the first step is, like any good athlete, corporate athlete, number one is you have to become an amazing listener before you ever become a great storyteller. So go to those local areas, or ask your teams what matters, what's happening. I always use the phrase context before content. So find out what's happening on the ground. Step two is testing. So once you've developed the story, by the way, just because you've written it doesn't mean it's right.
It's going to work,
yeah. And then test it on lots of different audiences against your demographics, your psychographics, target audiences, the personas as you perceive them, because those can change too. And lastly is practice. And most people tell me that it feels like they have like Legos in their mouth when they're first telling the story, especially when they try to adapt it to other cultures. And it should feel that way. So keep practicing it until it doesn't feel like a mouthful of Legos, and you get reactions from other people, or they're like, I get it. The last question is, would you be willing to share it? You know, can the people in those localities begin to share it? And I like reading local myth and lore, like the childhood stories.
Yes.
That we grew up. It's amazing. The nursery rhymes and the bedtime stories of different cultures are so instructive.
Yes.
So when you're on your 17-hour plane ride to go and share that new story of wherever you're going, or before you get on a Zoom call, ask some of those questions. Do a little Google search or have ChatGPT draw you up a bedtime story for the locale and see what comes up. Super helpful, like little basic things like that, just to get into the mindset, because we're all quite childlike when it comes to the core values that we
Yeah, absolutely. And we all have an innate creativity, whether it's been formatted out of us or not, we still have it. So if you go and get that, then you will spark that curiosity or that creativity, won't you, by what you're going to get. But so the process you've described, which is based on design thinking, some of it, I love the fact that it starts with empathy. I use design thinking for quite a lot of things like inclusion, you know, things that aren't that tangible yet, or that you have to define according to lived experience, or a little bit like storytelling, you define it according to persona or the audience. But I feel that there's a culture now around pitching, particularly that's linked to innovation in my head anyway, that is maybe doing a disservice to just how complex this process we're talking about is, because it's like, oh, well, you look at your hypotheses, you look at your customer needs, and you say, I'm doing this for the benefit of this, please buy this. So what are your thoughts on the trends that you see around the storytelling around innovation? And I'm particularly thinking of this whole pitching culture.
Yeah, I mean, it has become the reality. You know, when I think about where corporations were 20 years ago, it was the bench scientists and the technologists were coming up with the technology, and then the marketing team would go in and try to talk to those folks, you know, on one side of the building about what they were doing, and they would come out and translate. And so much of my work is actually holding workshops and trainings for those same bench scientists and technologists, because it's on them. You know, it's become kind of antiquated to think that a senior executive has a fleet of secretaries doing his typing for him anymore. The same is true with innovators and having a legion of people to do their translating for them. So as soon as McKinsey said that, you know, storytelling is one of the top 40 skill sets that every executive must have, it became clear that they were going to be responsible not for just explaining, but also coming with their hat in their hand and asking for money for the new idea, the breakthrough, et cetera. And so pitching has become part and parcel of the job description of the innovator. And so I feel like it's part of the culture, because, and it's the result of startup culture, going to venture capitalists and asking for money. Then there was this wave internally of large corporations creating intrapreneurship programs, you know, internal labs and innovation, you know, pitch nights and hackathons and everything else that was going on internally, the desire to incorporate startup culture to avoid tons of messy mergers and acquisitions. And so now all of those folks are seen as, those scientists now have to become intrapreneurs. So pitch culture has become part and parcel of corporate culture now, as part of the annual budget meetings, and the begging for money from the CFO is pitch me your idea in order to get budget for the breakthrough.
And do you think, from your work in organizations and what you see, do you feel that those leaders are adequately equipped, Susan, to actually pitch those ideas? Or is it always going to be a learning process, do you think?
I think it's always going to be a learning process. And here's why. It has to shift at the university level. Probably when you and I went to university, you know, one group went to the left side of campus, the humanities side, and another group went to the science side of campus. And the deeper we each got into our respective worlds, the language changed. And the guys on the men and women on the science side of campus were told, that what was happening on the humanities side of campus was fluff and bullshit and not worthwhile, unprovable, not empirical. And they never learned communication science. And the folks who are on the science side of campus said, with each PhD, get deeper, get more concentrated, get more focused. And the language became more and more specific and less human because we were operating at the electron level. Necessary for that group, but it becomes very difficult to come out of that milieu and begin to speak with everybody else. And so there's a gap. I don't blame it on the scientists. I blame it on our educational system that doesn't value communication science alongside the hard sciences.
And
vital skills for both.
Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting bringing those two things together and all the stereotypes and myths that come with it about how valuable they are, whether you need them. But it's the typical shift that we're seeing from experts to leaders. You know, when one of the only ways up in organizations, if you're an expert, was to get a team, even if you didn't want to manage and lead people.
Right.
And that expertise of you've got so much expertise in what you do that half of it is implicit for you, so you don't necessarily give all the information so that you're translating it in a relatable way. And I think that's hard, isn't it, to look at somebody who doesn't necessarily tell you they don't understand. They've just got that blank look on their face and you're thinking, okay, how do I translate this into normal people's language? So
yeah, and it's also why so many white collar workers are terrified by artificial intelligence, because we never learned to code. You know, we got handed software that felt like a pain in the neck every time we needed to upgrade or change. We created all the resistance paths in order for that, new innovation. And so shame on us on the humanities side, right? If we're not embracing anything beyond our iPhone as new technology, and maybe a dating app or two. But that's right. So this is where these worlds both have to come back together again so that we can actually create an AI that works for all of us.
I mean, it's a great segue into my next question, which was about that very thing, AI and generative AI and ChatGPT and how it's progressing. Do you expect AI to be able to do storytelling one day, Susan, or not?
So it's fascinating to me as I'm beginning to tease this apart because like many of your listeners probably, you got to get the blog out, you got to get a piece of content out, or you want to write something that feels good. And so I started off with an AI prompt to just get my brain moving over my morning cup of coffee. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I said, you have ChatGPT write it for me. And then I wanted to vomit because it was this boring listicle of something that no one was ever going to read or find valuable or interesting. So but I took the prompt and then just started writing something creative. And then I worked down a wormhole of, I wanted to write what triumph looked like. And so I started getting all these World Cup pictures, and I'm allergic to sports. I carry an EpiPen just in case a television comes on in a sports bar. But, but there was something about that emotion that prompted me. And the article that I wrote was completely different than anything I had thought of or wanted to write just by looking at that visual. And I go, oh, what a great idea. That is what I'm feeling. And so then that came to be. And so it's that spontaneity and serendipity that an AI can't, because it's drawing from the past.
Yes.
Right? It's drawing from. So the creation of something new is just an amalgam of old ideas, which, we might have called synthetic imagination back in the day, of how our own minds like, oh, I see that. I have a new idea, but it's old stuff. Okay, got it. But something wholly new is virtually impossible, I think, from this process. But I do think it is going to get closer and closer and closer. The other thing is a lot of technologies are being now generated by the spoken word. So I was meeting with a startup yesterday where there's like, don't write your blog, speak your blog. It's more conversational and whatnot. True. And it's so much easier to be like, oh yeah, I was thinking about this and blah, blah, blah. And you can go for a walk and write a blog at the same time, right? You just speak it into it, shapes and forms it. But the spoken word, if you've ever heard poetry read, is so much different than, or a song is different than the written word and its form. And it takes into account, the contemplative nature of it and the pausing in between and the going back and reading the line again. And so these are all the things we haven't figured out yet, but I believe it will be possible one day. So I'm investigating all the technologies and figuring out, because I want to create shortcuts for my client. I want to make it easier for them, but I don't want them to lose their authenticity. And that is the greatest ingredient of a great innovation story, is authenticity.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I was going to say, you know, how do you see your legacy? So what's your bigger quest? In terms of innovation storytelling? Clearly you do what you do and you help people tell stories. But if I listen to what you're saying about AI, then clearly there is a larger picture for you there about how you see legacy. Is a big word, but I think we should use it, because I think personally that's what motivates me, is to think I'm making an impact and I'm having a difference, however big or small other people think that is. For me, it's really important.
I think when I started this business, my desire was to make sure that no innovation was lost because it didn't have a story that could help the listener understand better. There's nothing more heartbreaking for me than to see an incredible innovation die on the vine because people couldn't understand its value. So that, if I can help every change maker better tell their story and have the skill set, it doesn't even have to be, I don't have to be with them. I just want them to have the tools in order to become a better storyteller, so their idea doesn't perish. That's really important to me. And the bigger context is, if innovation is about behavior change, then where are the other elements of behavior change that we all need, but through better storytelling? So whether that's the environment, or in my country here in the US, violence, about women's rights, or those issues about getting people to understand how a story can help change other people's behaviors, whether at the ballot box or elsewhere, then that's imperative. But I honestly believe it starts with the story that we tell ourselves.
Absolutely.
And who we are in that story. So sometimes we have to change how we see ourselves. And that's probably the hardest story to stomach.
Oh yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge. We're all made up of older past stories, aren't we, if I take the story lens? And how do we sort of intercept those and create our new story as we move forward?
You know, I'm kind of daunted by a meme I saw on Facebook the other day that said, if they're not wearing diapers, you can't change them. I think it was meant in a relationship context, but you know, it is a constant reminder of that. We start by changing ourselves first before we seek to change somebody else.
Absolutely. And just to come back to the other elements of behavioral change, I'm a big believer in communities. So communities of practice, or communities of innovation in this case, and particularly in a digital world where it enables those communities globally, which we didn't necessarily have that at our fingertips before. What is the role of communities for you in the behavioral change of innovation, and how important is it that organizations understand how to keep that momentum?
Oof. You know, I think it for me, it comes back to this empathetic listening. You know, in anthropology, we use a technique called appreciative inquiry, where we ask the question of what's actually working right now, and where can we build community off the things that are actually holding us together, that are working for us? Where is the good in this place? And starting from there. Sometimes that shared history that we talked about with the prophets is, you know, it's a shared history of pain and agony. I think about almost every Jewish holiday that I think about, I celebrate as a kid. And I have a varied background of half Jewish, half German, and I'm a Buddhist. So yeah, I'm a Jubilee, according to my friends. My mom was a Lutheran. You know, that shared history sometimes is a very painful history. But there's strength from that. So if we looked at our communities, where can we build from the positive? And then, you know, the other thing that surprisingly what binds us, the more and more you read on the literature, is those positives also come from pain. And so that we connect oftentimes over the trauma rather than the triumph. And so building communities is helping us get from from trauma to triumph too. And we do that. We don't do that alone.
No, and I love that idea of trauma, which is a word that is never used in organizations, but there is a lot of it.
Oh yeah. Ask what happened around the last round of layoffs, right?
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
happened last time the project you'd worked on for 2 years got killed, and tell me there's no grief and loss and so forth. We go through a lot of the grieving process and innovation of letting go of what's built upon.
And of course, it lies latent in system memory, doesn't it, in the organizational structure. So, I think the design thinking, different cognitive processes and emotional processes, which are also used in innovation, are very healing for organizations, but feel very unfamiliar. It's really interesting, though, if we come back to the profits, if I put us into 2030 and say, what would the storytelling look like? If I take your 5 rules of how they built their stories and why it was so powerful, for you, Susan, and I suppose my real question is, what's your vision? So in 2030, how would you see yourself telling the story of innovation to date? From everything you're seeing in organizations and all the impact it's having, the things that go right, the things that go wrong. I mean, humans don't change that quickly, unfortunately, or fortunately, but they don't.
But I will say this, over, 22 years of doing this kind of storytelling work, of watching how companies do this, they've, just like the computers around them, they've become faster and more intuitive than they were 22 years ago. Whereas, so in olden days, a large corporation might have dedicated $1 million to working on a prototype and kind of putting many eggs in one basket, with a lot of fear and trepidation that it would work, and that it had to work with, clenched fists and gritted teeth. And taking a page from the startup book, everything is now using lean methodology in many cases. And so we do these 6-week sprints of innovation. We test it. We get the idea together. We form a SWAT team. We try it out. We build it for 6 weeks. And then we get it to 85% okay. And then we unleash it on people to try it and say, give us your feedback.
Yeah.
And we let other people into the process faster. And I think that's been a remarkable shift inside of large organizations that has also allowed us to become more supple and more flexible in how we think about innovations. Like, oh, we're just going to test it. Let's not put the weight of the world on the experiment. And then we have to get way better at talking about where the failure was and the learnings from the failure. We get very reactive based on stock price about how to handle those waves but the ones that really weather it. And I work with corporate cultures like Corning Glass, that's 170 years old, that have been innovating all of that time, to really begin. They have an entire innovation library that chronicles everything they've built and how many of them that failed.
Wow.
And short story, the Corning made the vials for the Moderna vaccine that were required to hold very cold temperatures over long distances and long periods of time. Well, that was a recipe for that glass was created in the 30s, but had no use. It was expensive to produce, but had no use because long-term refrigeration didn't really exist. And so they unearthed that recipe for that glass and used it in the vaccine vials. What was even more fascinating was that although Corning is based in upstate New York, they had moved their 2 biggest production facilities to where in the world? Wuhan, China. And those glass vials with that 1933 recipe wound up being produced in the epicenter of the world's biggest pandemic. Who would have thought?
That is a fascinating story.
Yeah. And so the whole story is a longer form on my podcast as well, if you search on Corning. But that piece is a reminder to me of where is the flexibility, where's our ability to look backwards in order to look forwards. I think for the 2030 vision is, can we become ever more flexible? Can we become ever more listening to our past, our present, and our future? And most importantly, the people around us who have to help build it and spread the story. So the message to every executive is, be a better listener, right? 2 ears, 1 mouth for a reason. God knew what he was doing.
I'm going to quote you on that. Brilliant.
That's an old Sunday school
Yeah.
lesson
Two,
here in the
two ears,
States.
one mouth for a reason. Great.
Yes.
And
Stop talking. As a storyteller, stop talking. That's my biggest takeaway from the voyage of the dam to down to Florida during uni was
shut up, stop talking. And if you had one final call to action for our listeners, would it be that? Would it be 2 ears and 1 mouth? What would it be?
It would be put down the Excel spreadsheet and the 3 bullet points for every meeting you go to and stop for a moment. Because by the way, no one remembers it. We know that stories are 22 times more memorable than facts. Our brains were not built on Excel spreadsheets, to your point, right? That our culture existed for a very long time before the written word, right? Humanity existed for a very long time before that. So what can you bring to your next meeting where you develop deep empathy for the people around the table? Ask yourself what they need, not what you need. So 4 questions that every leader should ask before telling the story. Number 1, what do I want them to think? Meaning, what do I want them to remember by the time I'm done talking? So not your Excel spreadsheet and your 3 bullets, but write down 1 or 2. Number 2 is, what do I need them to do? And do is the actual call to action that you can write down for yourself. What do I actually need my people to do? And then ask yourself, what is the emotion that people need to feel in order to take the action? We don't act on fact, we act on emotion. So get really clear. If you want them to be terrified by your competitor, that's a good one. If you want them to feel innovative, smart, excited, map the emotion to your discussion. If you don't know what you want them to feel, they won't do it. The last is, what do you need them to do? But the last is also to say. So when they leave the room, what do you want them to say to the person when they just left the meeting, the next person they talk to, or the next person of consequence? What do they need to say? So have you pre-programmed your message in a way that is repeatable and memorable? So think, feel, do, and say. These are the things that every leader needs to think about before getting into their next meeting. And then create a story about it. Create a story around those 4 things. So it might be something like, if I want to energize people to go and do something, I say, it used to terrify me before I used to have to get up to the pitch, right? And think about protecting that goal, or, think about making that kick, whatever that may be. Again, I'm dying on the sports metaphor, but can you take people to the emotion that you are trying to pre-program into people? Think about a moment in time where you felt that feeling. And then the first memory that comes to mind will be your strongest. Tell the story of how you were a kid on the pitch trying to make that kick, and hear the adulation and the excitement, and then wrap your business story around that emotion, where you can say, we're at that same place again. We're at the pitch today because we're about to try to sell to our biggest customer. We're about to shut down a project. We're about to do X. And your team will be leaning in and riveted to what comes next, because they've already felt that emotion themselves in their own life. And that is where the connection happens, at the feeling, not at the fact.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to leave our listeners with those 4 questions instead of spending 3 hours getting 35 slides right. I'm going to leave them with that empathy map checklist around how to prepare for what they actually want their people to think, see, feel, and do. Okay. Super. Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for coming on and sharing your stories, and for a fascinating and a rich conversation. Where can people find out more about you, Innovation Storytellers, and what you do?
Sure. You can just go to innovationstorytellers.com. You will find a recent blog post all about those 4 questions: think, feel, do, and say. And you'll also see it on LinkedIn, or you can find me at Innovation Storytellers. I'm happy to help people and teams with their storytelling skill sets. And my dream is that all of your biggest ideas make it to their finish line.
Excellent. What a great ambition to finish on. Thank you, Susan. Thank you so much for a great conversation.
Thank you, Susie.